Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for tuning into this episode of Just Another Tinfoil Hat. I'm your host, Zelia Edgar. The aim of this show is to discuss all aspects of the paranormal from the relatively mainstream to the downright bizarre, to pose questions and entertain ideas regarding every angle of the unexplained. So, hang on to your tinfoil hats, keep your hands and feet inside the saucer, and please, enjoy the ride. Tonight, I am very pleased to introduce my guest. A lot of you will probably recognize him. He is a fellow researcher, fellow parishioner at the Church of John Keel, and a very good friend of mine, Steve Ward. Now, Steve Ward has been fascinated by the unexplained for over half a century. There were two major events that inspired his interest in the unexplained. Growing up in Michigan, the March 1966 UFO flap occurred virtually in his backyard, and on the following November, a winged humanoid chased two couples down a lonely country road near Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The legend of the Mothman was born. Steve would be chasing the Mothman the rest of his life. Influenced primarily by John Keel and Jacques Vallée, his views on UFOs became unconventional and moved more toward a paranormal explanation. Steve's main area of research is what some call high strangeness or window areas, as Keel dubbed them, where disparate types of paranormal phenomena all seem to occur in the same location, and he believes that studying these paranormally active locations may be the key to understanding what the origin behind these manifestations are. He has his own podcast on the Paranormal UK radio network called The High Strangeness Factor, and he's also currently writing a book. So, Steve, that's perfect because today our kind of theme for this episode, which was inspired, incidentally, by a comment on one of my videos, is both of our paranormal libraries. And I thought, especially too, I have to thank you ahead of time for helping me very much with the building of my paranormal library, that you would be the perfect person to have kind of as a co-host slash guest on this episode. So, Steve, thank you for being here.
My pleasure, and thank you for having me. I guess this is your first show in this particular format.
Yes, it is. There have been a lot of changes with my channel here, so I guess I should probably let everyone out there know that I have this new thing. I'll be posting all of my podcasts exclusively on my YouTube channel. I'm looking into other streaming options, and then, yes, they'll be posted in two parts every 2 weeks, except for Patreon patrons who have access to part 2 as soon as part 1 airs. So, welcome everyone to this new format. And again, Steve, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
And yeah, honestly, I am just so excited to have you here today because, we're both absolute maniacs, I feel like, with paranormal books and research. And I truly mean it too. Like, you've helped me so much with books and research and things like that. So thank you especially for being here today.
Well, some of it is due to my, I always, if I like a book and I see another copy at a good price, I'm always buying extra. Now, sometimes, I don't know if you're like me, have you ever purchased a book and then realized you already had it? Well, that's happened a couple times. But also, I have a library that's sort of organized by category, but there's times when I can't find a book, and I know I've got it. So I take the easy way out. I get on the keyboard, order it from Amazon, and 2 days later I've got another copy. So you have been the beneficiary of some of my flaws. So
well,
nice.
Thank you. And I get what you mean too. I know the thing is I'll organize my entire library perfectly, and it's usually by author because I'm like, okay, this is simple. They go together. But then you get the books where it's like co-authors, and you're like, okay, we'll put them next to each other. But then, you're doing research, you pull one out, and you're like, well, I'll be using this soon, so you put it aside. And then all of a sudden there's a pile aside that you've been using soon or recently, and it descends into chaos. So.
And then you've got the category problem.
Oh, yes.
Different authors, the same category, and yes, so you need your own cross-reference file, I guess.
Oh, geez, no kidding. But I suppose it's really interesting because I believe, if I remember correctly, we've discussed how we both got into the paranormal quite a few times before. And for you, it was kind of through science fiction, right, that you became interested in the paranormal.
Yes, I'd always had that interest. And then, of course, in the mid-'60s, we had the wave of sightings in Michigan, south central Michigan, Ann Arbor, Hillsdale, and so forth. And that's where Dr. J. Allen Hynek showed up and said that some of them might be swamp gas. And, of course, that has never died. And then several months later was the first sighting of the Mothman, one of the major first sightings in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Now, around that time, I was introduced by a friend of mine to the books of Frank Edwards. Frank Edwards he was a radio broadcaster, He was a colleague and friend of Donald E. Kehoe, who Donald Kehoe was the head of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP. And Edwards wrote these great anthologies, Stranger Than Science, Strangest of All. And it had this my first introduction to the Flatwoods Monster, to the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblins, some of the classic cases. Now, I think Mr. Edwards was a little fanciful in the way that he presented some of these. But then in the midst of this wave of interest in UFOs in about 66, or maybe 67, he wrote Flying Saucers, Serious Business. And that hit the bestseller list. So that was my first introduction to actually reading. And then, of course, I actually went to, I was not a big reader at that time, except for comic books. I could tell you all the supervillains that the Fantastic Four ever came up against, and who did the artwork and the inking and the lettering. But so that was kind of how I got started. And when I started going to the library and finding any book I could on UFOs, M.K. Jessup, the case for the UFO. He's the astronomer that committed suicide at one point, and there's all kinds of conspiracy theories around that. And even, I guess, some of the contactees, George Adamski, inside the spaceships, where you get the photographs of the classic Adamski flying saucer with the ball here. And so that was my, I couldn't differentiate between what was substantive and what wasn't at that time. But it was great. And just the last thing I'll mention is that I wanted to photocopy these images. Well, back in ancient times, this is back in the 60s now, copies cost 25 cents each. But you also had to make the negative and then take it again to get the positive copy of it. So you lost all kinds of detail, and it cost you 50 cents to get one picture.
That is dedication, I would say.
Yes.
Well, it's funny because as with a lot of things, because I know too, we kind of had our interest is interesting in the fact our interest is interesting. That's hilarious. Anyway, but no, it's funny because I know you kind of got involved with UFOs and then branched out towards the rest of the paranormal. And for me, I started with cryptozoology and kind of did the same thing all in reverse. And it's similar, too, with our interest, because now currently, and we'll get into this a little bit later, I have a huge interest in science fiction, cosmic horror, and things like that. But it actually started with almost a lifelong interest in the paranormal. And I blame part of this on my grandma, actually, because one of the very first paranormal books that I remember reading, and I was very young, so was Strange Stories, Amazing Facts. It's like a Reader's Digest compendium. And she had this. And so I was there. I was like a kid reading about things like, Fortean falls, such as falls of fish and things like that, spontaneous human combustion. And then, too, there were stories of ghosts and things like that. So that was one of my very first intros into the paranormal and strange. But then, too, around that same time, some of my favorite books as a kid were like the Childcraft compendium, so Great Myths and Legends. And the funniest thing is I remember The Story of the Sea was probably my favorite. And the thing is, they have a spot in there on myths and legends of the oceans. And they had something about a sea serpent. I remember as a kid thinking, man, this is amazing. There should be people writing about this stuff. And so I dutifully took some crayons and started copying down all of the information that was relevant. And this was, I would say, the beginning of my real interest in the paranormal. From there, I went to the library and picked up every book I could, which happened to include, as I've mentioned on many podcasts, John Keel's Complete Guide to Mysterious Beings. So that was kind of the nebulous, pre-interest in my study in the paranormal. And then that was definitely solidified. When I was 10, I had the pleasure of meeting Linda Godfrey and went to a book signing, and it was fantastic. Seeing that there are people, actual adults, who are researching this and taking it seriously. These were the first two of my own official paranormal books. So Hunting the American Werewolf and The Beast of Bray Road. And that was just instrumental in cementing my interest in the paranormal and, researching it seriously.
May I just do a little insert here? Can you see that all right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. That's in the Hunting the American Werewolf. It's the first time that Linda Godfrey talks about how she overlaid a map of the dogman sightings in southern Wisconsin, and found out they're very close to certain mounds, and especially the panther mounds and the water spirit mounds. And this was the book that she noticed, looked at the maps, and then looked at her reference to where these things are being sighted, and it's almost perfectly overlaid.
Oh, yeah, and these are just, I mean, it's amazing to me how much Linda Godfrey really kind of single-handedly brought these stories of upright canids to the forefront. There was a time where, she mentioned this in one of her books, actually, people would be fine reporting a Bigfoot. I mean, as fine as people can be reporting anything paranormal. But then you see something that you can only describe as a werewolf. And there's a huge stigma with that because, okay, we can possibly be like, okay, maybe there is some sort of undiscovered ape-like creature roaming the wilds of Wisconsin or whatever. As soon as you say, hey, I saw Lon Chaney Jr., it's a different story.
Right.
So it's amazing really how these definitely I feel like people do feel a lot more okay now reporting strange sightings of creatures like that, simply because they had someone who was willing to say, hey, I take this seriously. And here are hundreds of other people who have seen similar things.
For me, after that initial introduction, of course, we're going to talk a lot about John Keel, but I think I'd read some of his articles in the various. I loved the UFO magazines of the time, and I actually saw John Keel on a TV program. I inherited my grandparents' black and white TV that had UHF stations.
Oh, geez.
And it had the local UHF station for Detroit carried syndicated shows from New York. So we had the Joe Pine Show, who was kind of a shock jock and had all kinds of weird people on, including James Mosley from Saucer News. Another one was Alan Burke, who was kind of a refined gentleman with a beard and a cigar. And he had Ivan Sanderson on one time.
Oh, wow.
Ivan Sanderson, of course, is probably best known for the Abominable Snowman legend come to life and his other UFO books. Well, he and John Keel were colleagues, and John Keel was in the audience. He came up to the podium. They were talking about the Bermuda Triangle at the time. So I became introduced to Keel, and I think one of the early books by him that I read was Strange Creatures from Time and Space, otherwise known as The Guide to Mysterious Beings. And that was a grabber. And maybe later on we'll talk about Trojan Horse, which is the one that just completely shattered my paradigm. But go ahead.
Oh, yeah. No, I have a feeling once we hit Keel, it's going to be to be quite a conversation. I know I mentioned this before the program, but we could probably fill about 8 hours of a live streamathon, even just talking about John Keel's work. But no, continuing on too, Linda Godfrey, I mean, that was just such a changing experience for me because, I was 10 years old, got to meet a researcher who was also from Wisconsin and who was interested in all of these things that, a lot of people just kind of are like, a lot of people tend to just kind of ignore. The paranormal is something else, something that other people see, something that other people deal with. And that's not necessarily true. Again, I have a deep-seated belief that more people than not have experienced something they can't explain. And so to see someone bringing acceptance to that was very important to me. And then I was super lucky a year later, when I was 11, to meet Chad Lewis, who is the author of tons of books. This was the very first one I got, the Wisconsin Road Guide to Haunted Locations. And again, I saw one of his presentations when I was 11. And that was just, here again, we have another researcher from Wisconsin. And he, it was mainly ghosts that he was talking about at that time. And it was fantastic. And now, I swear, I don't know how many of his presentations I've been to. But that was just, it was fantastic. As a kid interested in the paranormal and the unexplained, to see people actually working in that was majorly important to me. And so, of course, Chad is the author of tons of books, and then he also has the Backroads Lore books, which one of the most recent ones, Wendigo Lore, is absolutely fantastic. I feel like it is the best word on the entirety of the Wendigo legend, and that's by Chad Lewis and Kevin Lee Nelson. Simply fantastic. I mean, genuinely, it's so much more in depth. I feel like with the Wendigo, people tend to look at it from any one point. Either it's a folktale, it's an actual monster, or it's, of course, the Wendigo psychosis, is how it's usually talked about and discussed. But this book really gives, proper explanation for each of these three different ways of looking at it. So it's simply fantastic. And I know you know Chad as well. We both met at Van Meter. So
yes, the Van Meter Visitor Festival. And that's my first introduction to Chad Lewis, Kevin Nelson, and Noah Voss, the three that compiled the Van Meter Visitor. And I remember hearing them years ago, all being interviewed on Coast to Coast AM. So they had, there it is, yes.
There it is, yes.
And a fascinating book. Such a great find to find this piece of folklore that probably is based on a real event from 1903, incredibly obscure. So, really, really interesting. And I might also mention about Chad, but I'm not holding it against him. He likes to make old guy jokes. He just delights in that. But of course, they just, I just turn the other cheek.
Well, I mean, he did let me know that you are an immortal who was there at the events of the airship flap in 1897. So,
okay. Well, that one I didn't hear.
Oh, geez. But I mean, and the Van Meter Visitor, that is just a fantastic little segue to take here, because it's one of those things where, the classic monsters are fantastic. You hear stories of all of the big guys, like the Kelly Hopkinsville scenario, or even the Mothman. But when you find something new, something that hasn't been researched before, I mean, that's just got to be so fantastic. What an
incredible find.
And the Van Meter Visitor, too, I mean, the amazing thing is how, again, with all of these different things, how well it plays into so many of the patterns and parallels, we're both very interested in. From the strange missing time that accompanied it to the single red light that it had. It is very much in line with a lot of these other kind of anomalous creatures.
It's interesting, and we've talked about this before, how you get the standard cryptids, if you will, sometimes with variations. But every once in a while, you get the crazy off the wall. I mean, it's all supposed to be crazy and off the wall, but you get these ones that just don't match anything. The Dover Demon, for example, and what's the one in New Jersey that just slipped out of my mind?
The Jersey Devil. Yeah.
Now that's one that's kind of it's a lot of people have seen it, and I guess it fits the winged creature like Mothman. And everybody wants to call everything that has wings on it these days Mothman. But yeah, you get these, but the thing is, you get credible people that see these other things that don't fit, that make you think, well, how do we explain this? I mean, it's hard enough to try and come to grips with Bigfoot and the upright canids, and try and explain how they can be real and not be detected as much. Mm-hmm. But, so it's just, the Van Meter, and we should mention that the Van Meter Visitor Festival is a really great event. Mm-hmm. Van Meter is just west of Des Moines, Iowa, and it's held the last weekend in September, which to commemorate the same time period in 1903 when the events took place.
And it is, it's just fantastic too, because with the Van Meter Visitor, I mean, it's true, Van Meter is a very small town in Iowa. And then now that this legend has kind of been brought to life, it's true, the whole town turns out pretty much for the Van Meter Visitor Festival. You got people coming from all over the country to present. So it's really neat to kind of see a monster bring a town together like that. So. And
Chad does this great walking tour with his little speaker on his belt and his microphone, and takes you through the week of terror and points out the buildings of what they used to be back in 1903 and about the witnesses and what their experience was.
Yeah, such a fantastic time. Looking forward to that this year. So, gosh, I'm trying to think, there's so many different routes we could go. Is there anything in particular that you would like to start off with? Because I know it's, theme again is just our paranormal libraries, and I know we both have quite the selection, but...
Let me just mention, and I am going to have to bend down here.
Yeah.
We won't, we can cover more Keel later, but I did mention UFO's Operation Trojan Horse, and that's where John Keel brought all these different elements together. I mean, I was convinced, as so many were and still are, that we're strictly dealing with ET, flesh and blood creatures, and metallic craft, and so forth. This is Operation Trojan Horse right here. I get reflection off of it. And this one, I wasn't real happy with it when I started reading it, but he convinced me with his argument. And that was followed by, and I don't have it with me, Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia, where he makes a connection between folklore. You got that one there?
Yes, I do.
Ah, yes.
There we go.
And that's another, I tell people I barely recovered from Trojan Horse, and then I read Magonia, and that was it. Here's my original version of Trojan Horse.
Oh,
Dust jacket, long gone. It has the original index in it and all my notes and everything. So
that is fantastic.
That's it right there.
Yeah, no, it is kind of interesting, but I read, how did it go? So I read Complete Guide to Mysterious Beings when I was probably, I don't know, 7, 8, 9. I was very young, so it was kind of like, it was always back in my subconscious, I guess, but of course, I didn't realize it was even Keel until many years later. So technically the first Keel book that I read was Mothman Prophecies. And then after reading Mothman Prophecies, I went to Operation Trojan Horse. And the funny thing is that Prophecies, I was still very much looking at all this stuff as separate. I was thinking, okay, there's cryptids, there's ghosts, there's UFOs. And then Mothman Prophecies, he really, reading it now, he definitely makes the case for his more, I would almost say, unified field theory of the paranormal. But even then, I still was looking at the events of Point Pleasant as, okay, well, the UFO people were obviously interested in whatever cryptid this was. And this cryptid was kind of weird. I think it was probably interdimensional, like he's saying. But, still we have this separation. Operation Trojan Horse is what totally just killed that notion for me. Reading that, in my opinion, there was no way I could come away from that still thinking that the majority of sightings of UFOs were actual extraterrestrial craft. So...
And the strange creatures from time and space kind of prepared the way a little bit, because that's where he first talks about window areas and how trying to come to grips with why these things seem to sort of pop in and pop out. And it also kind of paves the way to these high strangeness areas like Point Pleasant, like the Skinwalker Ranch, like the Bridgewater Triangle, and Sidonia, the Bradshaw Ranch, etc. Why is it that in a single location, people are experiencing all these things? But Keel went further and demonstrated that some individuals are tuned in somehow, where they will see strange lights in the sky. They may have a cryptid experience. And I've interviewed people that have had missing time and have sought what happened to them through a therapist. And when you start asking the John Keel questions, the list of John Keel questions, you find out these strange events have followed them all their lives.
And there's another author and researcher, Jenny Randalls, who is very much in line with that theory as well. I know that Mind Monsters, I think, is probably, I loved that one, just because, I don't know, the organization style was very nice, and it was a compendium of so many different accounts, which I just, I love. And she really propounded this theory. The tagline for that book is Invaders from Inner Space. And it's just fantastic. But in some of her other work, too, I know in the Pen on UFO Mystery, she even discusses how a lot of witnesses to one type of paranormal phenomena end up being repeaters. And I think that that's a really important concept to pin down, that if someone, sees a UFO, there's a high tendency that then they'll say, oh yeah, well, the house I grew up in was haunted. Or one of my aunts saw a Bigfoot. And she really pinned that down, I feel, in the Pen on UFO Mystery, where she talked about how a lot of these repeater witnesses had early sightings of light phenomena, which was really, really interesting. And of course, too, that's the one that details Linda Godfrey's infamous encounter aboard the UFO. Yeah. Yes,
and he it was a sort of a classic. Well, they had several overtones of fairy lore. Again, Jacques Vallée pointed out the connections between modern-day UFO experiences and classic folklore from various traditions. And in the Godfrey encounter, he has he couldn't even look at them. He thought they were hideous. And I'm assuming there's something like little grays or whatever they were. But there's also the tall being, almost angelic, kind of in charge. This guy had robes and so forth. Sometimes you're dealing with the fairy queen, which seems to be in charge of the shorter ones. But then also, all of a sudden, he talks about, again, under hypnosis, seeing this black dog inside supposedly a metallic craft from elsewhere. And he said it looked hideous. And when you think about the traditions of the UK, the black spectral dogs that haunt the moors and so forth. In fact, I think I like dog folklore, and there's this looks like a pretty good collection of various accounts, and you just can't ignore. We don't know exactly what it is and why do these things take certain shapes. Why aren't they sort of a plethora of different creatures or animals? Why do we get these consistencies, which it doesn't really, you wonder, maybe they're just like basic archetypes that they're all part of us. I don't know.
Well, the intriguing thing too is, as evidenced by this fantastic tome, which is a really amazing collection of the more classic black dog encounters. The black dog is a well-established, I would say, archetypal manifestation across ghost lore. And fairy lore. There's the fairy dog, which appears in some traditions. And so you have this really well-established type of manifestation. And then all of a sudden with, these UFO encounters, because, there's the Linda Godfrey encounter where the black dog was in the spaceship. There was another encounter from Webb's 1973 Year of the Humanoids, where the UFO was seen over a graveyard, and a pack of black dogs came out of it. And then, too, of course, in another amazing book, The Dubbed Enigma, by Holliday and Pugh, they had so many accounts of black dogs. There was a black dog being seen in an area where there was a UFO sighting. A lot of the animals were reacting, especially dogs were reacting to these strange things that were going on. So
I bent down because I had 1973 Year of the Humanoids, but it has vanished mysteriously. That was written by Dr. David Webb, and I actually got to meet him at the MUFON Symposium in 1976. I got to speak to him for a while. It was published by the Center for UFO Studies, which was J. Allen Hynek's group. Once he had long ago left Project Blue Book, changed from the black hat to the white hat, became one of the good guys, and didn't have to be cynical, and he could be a true skeptic. And he really started to feel that there was something to this, even while he was attached to Blue Book. But it was great because I talked to David Webb about John Keel. I mean, as I told you before, I was preaching the Church of John Keel to all these people back in the middle 70s that didn't want to hear about the paranormal or the psychic aspects of any of this. And I said, I think I'm really grateful for what Keel, the groundwork he laid. And he said, I think we're all grateful for John Keel. And I was going, yes, David, all right. He was one of the few that was open to that kind of research at that time, because people were just very focused into the other aspects. But yes, it was the 1973. There were a lot of, in the U.S., there were a whole wave of humanoid landings. Now, some of them were definitely hoaxes, but others are very interesting. There was even some that of the famous, of course, we know about the famous Pascagoula incident, 1973.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Calvin Parker is kind of resurfaced after being quiet for so many years and written a couple of books. And Charles Hickson, who also experienced it, these were two fishermen in Pascagoula in, was it November of 73 or October, maybe? October, I think. Yeah. And so there were some other reports of creatures like that at the time that Webb chronicled. And there was even the other strange. Did you mention the one in the cemetery? Did I miss that?
With the pack of black dogs
in Savannah, Georgia, the Laurel Grove Cemetery. Now, again, we don't know if it's true or not, but supposedly this craft had landed there, and the door opens and 10 of these black dogs usher out. And I'm thinking, okay, I kind of hope that's a hoax, because if it's not, it's really creepy. I mean, it's bad enough it happened in the cemetery.
No kidding, right? I know. Maybe the aliens are somehow, I don't know, they're in cahoots with the graveyard brims.
Or maybe they just we got to let them outside. We've landed, so they have to do their business and be done with it.
Oh my gosh! Now that is truly fantastic. The thought of aliens being like, okay, time for walkies.
But there's great. I haven't checked it for a while, but you can still find it online sometimes.
Yep.
And there's all these great books that are out there, are hidden, that haven't been reprinted for a long time, that have great information in them. And I want to ask you something.
Sure
Do you find that when you're reading a book and then you read the reference, so you go to the bibliography, you think, oh my God, I got to have it. I've got to have it. I've got to have it. And how many books does one book generate that you eventually buy or put on your list to buy? It just never ends.
Well, that is exactly what happens with Joshua Cutchin.
Oh, yes.
Oh, my word. He has such an extensive bibliography for each of his books. It's simply fantastic. And I love that, too, because you can really, well, it's kind of like Passport to Magonia has that fantastic list of sightings. But no, I love having that extensive bibliography there just because then it's true. If you want more information about any particular sighting or story, you can just look it up yourself and find it, which is very fantastic. So,
and also his book, Thieves in the Night, which focuses very much on fairy lore. Mm-hmm. I even wrote him. I was blown away. I said, Joshua, you have forced me to buy dozens of more books to see this incredible. You have the footnote, and you can go back and see what he's referenced, and it's just astounding. And the amount of, I have a whole stack of 2 stacks of books, obscure books on folklore that have all these little interesting tidbits that connect to other things like modern day UFO experiences and so forth.
Yeah, well, and I think that too with Cutchin's books, the thing is that I was excited because the first one that I read was A Trojan Feast. And, I was thinking it was mainly going to be about the connection between UFO and fairy lore, which I think is, that's still something that should be discussed because even though it was kind of nailed down, I feel, by Vallée in Passport to Magonia, there's still a lot of people who think that it's very separate. And so I think that it is it's a very noble task to still kind of be like, okay, well, look at all these parallels here. But then he started tying in Sasquatch. And I was blown away because here again, you have these connections between something which, on face value, who would connect Sasquatch with fairy lore? And then you start seeing these parallels, and he has, again, just so much research and so many very neat and tidy arguments. Also, the organization style of his books, I love it. So
I know it kind of puts me to shame. I haven't finished my book yet, but just when I think about, oh man, what I have to look up to. But did he cover the horse braiding, horse mane braiding at all? And I wonder, because that's something that I have found is consistent. A lot of people believe that Bigfoot comes in and braids the horse manes. Well, then there's also the tradition of the Lutton in Newfoundland, which a lot of the traditions came over from the old country to Newfoundland. And there was this one gentleman that was being interviewed in The Good People. That's even a book that David Paulides references. David Paulides, the missing 411 author. And this guy said, with a straight face, he said, the Luttons come into his barn and they braids the horse mane. And then I found out from another researcher that we have at Detroit, near where I grew up, we have the tradition of the Nain Rouge, a little red demon-like guy, and he's supposed to be attributed that same thing to him. So who knows how much substance there is to these, but still you get these same traditions across, Bigfoot, little elf-like creatures or whatever, and little red devils. Yeah. So, and I think there's even some more, but it's just really interesting.
Yeah, I bet you any money, because I don't have his latest book with Timothy Renner, Where the Footprints End, which just came out, and that's
in 2 parts now. I got the
yeah, and I know that's one too that I'm very excited about. But no, each of the Brimstone to See Thieves in the Night and A Trojan Feast, just because again, I am just fascinated by how again, like you were saying, so many of these different types of phenomena have such parallels. And, again, just so the way his books are organized is so clear cut, and so it's just glaringly obvious when you read through them, the similarities, which is just simply fantastic.
I was going to say that that's a reason why, there's a lot of division in the field about whether things are real substantive flesh and blood, or whether they're something more ethereal or paranormal or whatever. The word interdimensional gets thrown out around quite a bit.
Yeah.
But the thing is that if we're listening to what people are experiencing, that's something we really need to do. It's very easy that when we hear some of the really strange stuff, the high strangeness, to kind of throw it out and think, well, they must be imagining things. Yeah. But it's really important to look at the whole spectrum, because then kind of follow the path that Keel did in his research and in Trojan Horse, and others that followed him. There was a Swedish researcher whose name I can't recall, that was a friend of Keel's and a colleague, and he came to Point Pleasant about a year or two later. He found that most of the people that had seen the Mothman had also experienced poltergeist phenomena in their homes. So it's hard enough to explain the Mothman, who didn't have a wide enough wingspan and seemed to defy physics or something that would be biologically sound. But then you add in the supernatural element of the poltergeist. And then we talked about the dogmen. Keel kept finding these large dog-like footprints near where the Mothman was. And it wasn't the Mothman. He didn't have big floppy feet. And others have found the same thing in high strangeness areas. So it's very hard to put it together and categorize it, but it's something I think we have to do to try and get the whole picture and not reject things out of hand.
Well, and I think you bring up a great point too, where there is a lot of division between the flesh and blood, nuts and bolts people, and the more, like you were saying, the ethereal, possibly, again, like you said, interdimensional gets thrown out a lot, side of things. And the truth of it is that I do feel like, in a way, I think that there's just more than one right answer, which is why I grabbed two very different books. You've got Stan Gordon's Silent Invasion.
Oh, yes.
Which details some fantastic, if you want high strangeness with Sasquatch, there are just innumerable cases that you simply can't explain by the flesh and blood side of things. But then, too, I also have, Grover Kranz's Bigfoot Sasquatch evidence book. And so, you do have a lot of evidence for there being some sort of real creature. And I know for me, again, I started with cryptozoology. Old habits die hard. Bigfoot is the one I have major nostalgia for. And I think that we don't, until we know for certain, I feel like any answer is valid. You can't discount the high strangeness and say, oh, it's simply a great ape. And in the same vein, I think that there's enough room to believe that there may be some sort of population of genuine animals. Now, would there be then the high strangeness side and the animals? Do these animals simply have some sort of abilities that we don't understand yet? These are all questions that I don't know the answer to. But I think it is important kind of to have that balance of, the flesh and blood, very classic research, and then the genuine high strangeness research.
Well, that's one of the few things I think we can say definitively is that there's more than one answer. That's not too many things you can say definitively. I think it was Keel that introduced the idea. Well, he talked about paranormal mimicry, but he may not have meant it in exactly this area. But some have suggested that we are being visited by others. In some cases, there are unknown creatures that are not documented yet. But there's something in the human psyche that copies them, that mimics them somehow. And I haven't really figured all that out yet. But that could explain the physical and the ones that like the from Silent Invasion that Stan Gordon talks about.
Yeah.
Are just bullets don't hurt them, and they sound like a baby crying. The same kind of a thing you hear in some poltergeist cases, the sound of a baby crying. In conjunction with UFOs, and one of the witnesses became sort of possessed, or it was under some kind of spell for a while.
Yeah.
And stuff that just, and some police officers were on the scene. So, it's just, you wonder sometimes, why do we punish ourselves doing this? Because, it's not just going down the rabbit hole. You get stuck in there and you can't get out.
Well, and then there's like 5 other rabbit holes off to the side, and then there's probably, a Mongolian death worm tunnel nearby. And
those are the worst.
But before we get too long, too, because I know you mentioned paranormal mimicry and the others amongst us and things like that, I want to discuss Demonic Reality by Patrick Harpur, which is
Yes.
one of my current favorites. However, as we are nearly at the halfway point, I am going to take a moment here to say that part 2 of this fantastic episode, My Paranormal Library with Steve Ward, will be available in 2 weeks' time, unless, of course, you are a Patreon patron. If you are, then part 2 will be up as soon as I'm done talking. So thank you very much for tuning in, and catch you next time.